this being Woah Wednesday, and I'm talking about RPGs once again, you have your different diagonals. You have, as you can see, there's typically four systems you use for the grid. Diagonals cost 1, diagonals cost 2, diagonals cost 1.5, and the first diagonal costs 1 and the rest cost 2. Personally, I think that the most accurate and best one to use is the diagonals cost 1.5, but that tends to mean that you have to do math while you're doing it, and in the middle of a game that might not be ideal. And, we're talking about a role-playing game. You might have 6 people at the table. To do the math to do that for every fireball could definitely slow down your game. Now, admittedly, the fireball's only out to the 4. It should be pretty obvious what you're supposed to do, but some people struggle with that. So, where diagonals cost 1.5 is not the best for everyone. I've noticed certain people like to make diagonals cost 1, which is silly. It doesn't make any sense to me. There is no geometric world where diagonals only cost 1, where I can run further along 2 axes than I can run along either any other axis. That just doesn't make any logical sense. Diagonals cost 2, it's like the opposite problem. So if diagonals cost 1, you have it's too fast. With diagonals cost 2, it's too slow. Running in a diagonal is clearly worse than running in any other direction. So why would you ever do that? The first one, then 2, is reasonable. It has shortcomings. As you can tell, it looks a bit it's a bit skewed. The edges are a bit flat, but it makes it easy to count. You can move 1 step in any direction, and then to move further than that, then you have to then it costs more to move. So that's a reasonable compromise, and it probably will work for most people playing games most of the time, at least. So those are all reasonable and acceptable variations on how to use diagonals in any role-playing game, really, for a grid system. But there's also this idea of a hex system, like what you can see here. And the hex system is interesting because diagonals are no longer a trouble, circles are no longer a trouble. You lay down a cone on a hex system, and it makes sense where they should go, really. It's not terribly difficult to figure out how that should lay out. But it makes it really awkward to build certain kinds of terrains, because you'll have these quarter squares or quarter hexes or half hexes or partial hexes all the way throughout your terrain, and that makes it messy. You've got these holes where somebody can't really fit, but there's obviously space there, and it makes it a lot more complicated to move, to like create a line or wall, because you're working within the hexes, and so it makes it so certain kinds of layouts are more inconvenient. But with diagonals, it makes diagonals great. You got your 5 foot, 20 foot, 10. I think that's 10-foot radius. They all work out real nice. It's very obvious where you can go and how far you can move. And so that's kind of an ideal system for some people. I know that 2nd edition D&D, while they didn't officially say you should play on hexes, they definitely referenced character positions on a hex-based system, where you had your front and your flanks, and it was all laid out on a hex system, not on a grid. 3rd edition D&D is really where the move to the grid started, and we started having people pretty much solely using the grid for doing the role-playing games. Um, I can't think of a more recent hex system that wasn't space combat. One of the things that's nice about hexes is for stuff like space combat, because it's much easier to calculate and define movement for a continuous moving body in a hex, because I want to do a partial turn or a slow looping turn. I don't have that weird diagonal thing going on like over here. Well, how do I describe over here using doing a turn in space? If I want to do a slow arcing turn where I can turn so many degrees every turn, bank so many degrees every turn of time, that is, then I need to do a lot of math, need to work out these equations. It's not simple spheres. It's not like turn to turn I'm moving forwards and I can count squares. I have to have this organic motion, and that organic motion just doesn't work on a grid. So hexes are really ideal for when you're dealing with ships, spacecraft, planes. There's not a better system for them. But all of those are not in a, or at least not usually in a interior area where you care about where the walls are. So like for D&D, you've got your dungeons and then you got your outdoors. Hexes are always better outdoors. They make more sense outdoors. They're easier to represent outdoors. You put an obstacle, well, this is just a hex you can't go in. It's simple. When you move from the outdoors to the indoors, the grid system is far superior. As soon as you have close and closed spaces, grids all the way, because grids are much more straightforward. They're closer representative to indoors, and they're easier to work around. I mean, you just sort of can lay out where you want to go and you go. It's not hard. It works better for the small scale combat. Yeah, I mean, when you start even dealing with outdoors with the various terrain types, it's still better on a hex. There's very few times where, well, I'm gonna have a forest. Well, that's still better on a hex. I go, here's a tree, here's a tree, here's a tree. Obviously, you can't move into those hexes because there's a tree there. Very obvious what you can do and can't do. There's a river. Well, rivers typically don't follow a grid. Much easier on a hex system. It's easier to represent even small medium objects, bigger objects. The bigger the object, the more hexes it takes up. Very straightforward. Those same things are sometimes more complicated to do in a grid system because of the fact that it's so cordoned off. If you're not dealing with artificial constructions or artificial structures, things that were made by people, the grid system starts to break down really quickly. So, I guess one of the big comments I have about the hexes versus grids is that it depends on the environment you're talking about. Interior man-made structures are almost always going to be better handled using the grid system, but the external outdoor environments are better handled using the hex system. Now, I will say that there are games, usually in the wargaming arena, that use tape measures. And you don't actually have a grid or a hex that you're on. You have distances, and they're to scale distances using inches, usually. I guess in over in Europe, you guys actually might use centimeters. I've never looked. I've never seen one of your miniature games over there, and so I can't tell you what you use. Maybe one of you from Europe actually plays some war games, plays some Warhammer, and you can tell me whether you guys use inches or centimeters when you're dealing with miniature distances. Interesting thing to learn about. But I know in America at least, it's inches, obviously. And somebody was commenting about how I should talk about the difference between the 2 action point system and the time unit systems for strategy games. And I think they're right that that's kind of its own video. It's a pretty complicated topic. There's definitely advantages to both systems. There's definitely diminishing returns with a time unit system when you were talking about large units. Once you get over about 15 to 20 guys, the time unit system starts to really break down. And the 2 action point system for small units tends to lose precision, which is a common complaint with the new XCOM games, is that the 2 action point system is really limiting in its tactical variety. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask if you have any questions. But I will say that the 2 action point system in small units is very close to a board game. When people say it's board gamey, they're right. It's very much what you'd expect from a board game. You've got your Clue or your Monopoly or something. You've got your action to move, your action to do something. Some games you can sacrifice an action to do something to move again. Some games you can't, but your action to move, your action to do something is a common system in all kinds of board games. You've got Clue and Monopoly and Life and all sorts of games use this idea of you move, then you do. And sometimes you can do something, then move, then do something else. Depends a little bit, but it's generally move, do. And that's very good for simple games. It also works really well when you've got large armies. When you've got 100 miniatures out on the table, you really don't want to have to precisely maneuver. Well, I'm going to move 6 centimeters this way and then 6 centimeters that. It doesn't make any sense. You've got 100 guys. You can't move 100 guys and take that much time per guy. It doesn't work. Nobody else will play. It'll take you an hour to do your turn and then an hour to do the next guy's turn. And by the time 3 turns are done, you're done for the night and you're going home. So that just doesn't work. But on the other hand, the 2 action point system does really limit your game when you're talking about small units. When you've got 4 guys and they've got 4 guys, well, I can move and then shoot, or move and then move. I mean, what kind of choice is this? I've got 4 guys. My turn's going to be over in 10 seconds, and then it's going to be their turn. Their turn's going to be over in 10 seconds, and then it's my turn again. I might as well be playing Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering has more steps per turn than that. You've got, 7 phases per turn in Magic the Gathering? Upkeep. Draw card. Main phase 1, combat main phase 2, end turn. 6? I don't know, maybe there's another phase that I'm missing, something like that. But anyway, you've got a lot of steps to your turn in Magic the Gathering, and you've got fewer than that if you've got just a 2 AP system for a small unit. And that's, not ideal. You want diversity, you want interesting gameplay, right? One of the things that role-playing games tend to have over war games is that you have diversity of action. Even if you only really have two kinds of actions that you can do per turn in most role playing games. I mean, you usually have your move action and your standard action, or something similar to that. Adjust this down a little bit. So you got your movement action, your standard action, but you've got 100 options for your standard action, and even for your movement action, you've got a fair number of options. A lot of role playing games, there's like tumbling, there's jumping, swimming. Flight is a common feature. So your movement action isn't just I can walk up these few feet. It's I can I can do any motion, any movement my character is capable of. That's what my move action's for. And then your standard action is anything that my character can do, I can do. Whether that's swing my sword, cast a spell, throw a bomb, throw some acid. I mean, there's name a role playing game. There's a dozen plus actions that you can do. And that's at first level. As you go up in level, more actions become available to you. So it's kind of diverse what you can actually see happen in a role playing game. It's not limited to one thing or another thing. It's a whole myriad of actions that you can choose. And going back to that, the motion and the movement, it's kind of why that's important, because when you have so many choices, it's kind of important that you're consistent with how you do those choices, what kinds of choices you're allowed to do, and how those units will be measured. When I cast Fireball, it has a 20-foot radius. I want to know what that 20 feet encompasses. 20-foot cube is a very different thing than a 20-foot radius sphere. But if diagonals only count for one, it's actually the same thing. There's absolutely no difference. So it's something to keep in mind. One thing that I think is heavily overlooked in most role-playing games is the potential three-dimensional aspect of a game. They don't describe motion in 3 dimensions very often, but there's no reason why you can't have 3-dimensional encounters. I mean, the ranges are generally not that complicated. As long as you're within range, the fact that there's a third dimension matters very little. A 60-yard range straight out isn't too different from a 60-yard range straight out up a little bit. And that's not where the circle suffers. The circle suffers up here, not up a floor. And so something that you can use in role-playing games to spice up encounters is things like balconies, parapets, second-story windows. I mean, there's no reason why everybody engaging you has to be on the same level ground as you. Who does that? If you're gonna ambush somebody, you do it right. You put people up on the second floor. It's harder to aim up than it is to aim down. Easier to see somebody when they're below you than when they're above you. So you might as well. So just general GM tip for people who want to run a game. Elevation is a cool trick to use. It'll throw off your players at least once. After the first time, they'll probably start to expect it, but maybe they're slow learners and it takes them 3 or 4 times. But I would definitely use elevated terrain, and in general, it won't affect your grid too much. It might affect something like a fireball, lightning bolt with its radius, but most of the time, 3 dimensions won't affect what you're doing too much. No reason to bust out your calculator to do some trigonometry. I mean, if you're that kind of nerd, awesome. But most of us are not interested in our combat to do enough in our combat to do trigonometry to solve where something is going to be. Sorry, it's just that's not my thing. I love math. I still don't want to do trig when I come to the D&D table. Not a thing I enjoy. But I recommend using 3 dimensions. I definitely would recommend using a hybrid of hexes and grids in any game that you're running. I haven't had a lot of opportunities to do that, but that definitely would be advantageous. It'll make your encounters more interesting, and it'll make it easier to do certain types of encounters. I think I've run out of things to say on that topic. So, if anybody has any questions, that would be a great time to ask some questions, because I'm happy to answer the questions, but I don't have anything more to spit out on my own. I so much to say about movement in role-playing games. It's a pretty banal topic most of the time. Well, hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I uploading it shortly hereafter to YouTube for those of you who are watching the stream. And I'll see you guys next week.